As people begin entering, just so you know, we will officially start at 7 p.m. this evening, a couple minutes until that time. And then until then, just please hang out, and we're excited for you all to listen to this event.
All right, it is officially 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Welcome to Beyond the Field. We are a programmatic effort housed in the Nia School of Education, specifically the Sport Management Program. For those of y'all who are not familiar with Beyond the Field, our purpose is to examine how sport is a vehicle for understanding social change. Our first segment in September examined how can we better contextualize and understand Black Lives Matter and Black athlete protests. Today, we will be examining collegiate athletics and the global pandemic that we are still in. We have some awesome speakers for y'all, but first I just want to do some thank yous. So thank you to the Nia School of Education, specifically Stephanie Dion, who has live streamed this event. We have some key background individuals. Thank you, Nana Amos, Eli Wolf, and Colin Ebron. And for those of y'all who don't know me, my name is AJ Newton. I am a fourth-year doc student in the Sport Management Program. And thank you to our sponsor, the UConn Human Rights Institute. Thank you so much. And I'm going to kick it over to my co-moderator, Charles.
Thanks, Ajane. Welcome everyone tonight. I'm Charles McCauley. I'm a fourth-year PhD student at the University of Connecticut, along with Ajane. And I'm very excited tonight to introduce our panelists. So first up, we have Dr. Derek Silva, who is currently an assistant professor of criminology at King's University College in London, Ontario. So I'm excited to have a fellow Canadian here on the panel. You've noticed from the wrong coast. That's okay. Also, in addition to being an assistant professor, Dr. Silva is the co-host of the End of Sport podcast, which examines various social issues as they intersect with sport, including swimming culture, gymnastics, and also, of course, college athletics in the pandemic. Next up, we have Dr. Victoria Jackson, who hails all the way from Arizona today. So she is currently a clinical assistant professor of history and an affiliated faculty member at the Global Sport Institute at Arizona State University. Her work primarily focuses on the 100-year history of higher education and college athletics and how it's landed us in the mess that we're in today. In addition to doing that work, she is a frequent contributor to the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, Boston Globe, Slate, as well as several other newspapers and magazines. And she's also a former Division I runner and currently still finds a lot of enjoyment running, something I don't. So kudos to you. Next up, we have Dr. Derek E. White, who is currently a professor of history and African American and Africana studies at University of Connecticut, at the University of Kentucky. My bad. So sorry.
Okay.
I'm sure there's some individuals out there cursing my name right now for doing that. So he was an a visiting associate professor at Dartmouth College, and he's been recognized for several publications, including his work Blood, Sweat, and Tears, which has garnered a number of accolades and recognitions. He's also managed to transfer his love of African American history and sports into a profession. Next up, we have Nia Willis, who is a current Division I basketball player at Presbyterian College in South Carolina. The game for her began in the 3rd grade, and she's had many successes and accolades ever since, including winning the award of Female Athlete of the Year, both as a junior and senior in high school. She also scored over 1,000 points in high school, and also is serving as a captain for her team. So thank you, Nia Willis, for being here, and everyone else on the panel for being here this evening. We're really excited for this conversation. Before we get into the meat of our content, what we really want to open up with tonight is something that we borrowed from the End of Sport podcast, which is Dr. Silva's podcast. And we just want to check in with you all to see how you're doing, given the fact that we're in a pandemic, as well as everything else that's going on in our society. So actually, Nia, we'll start with you. How are you doing, given everything that's going on?
You know, with everything going on, I'm blessed to say that I'm healthy and I'm alive. So I can say that I'm doing pretty well.
Awesome. Thank you. Dr. White.
Everything is good as far as, the pandemic and everything else is going. I'm happy. Family's healthy. So I'm happy to be here.
Dr. Silva.
Yeah, I just to echo what others say, happy to be healthy. I'm grateful to be healthy. I've been able to kind of stay in my basement for a few months. So everyone other than my partner is super happy. But yeah, overall, really excited to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Awesome. And then Dr. Jackson.
Yeah, I mean, just not to repeat everyone else, grateful to be all right. It's still summer in Arizona, so there's that going on. And I have a remote learning kindergartner, which if I speak too loudly, he'll come out and get excited that I'm speaking about him. So, the balancing act is always crazy with little kids. It's been challenging even more so for those of us with the at-home learning. So, I added a kindergarten class to my teaching schedule this fall, so that's been fun.
Awesome. Thank you all for sharing. I'm glad to hear that you've all been able to stay safe and healthy and picking up new skills as we go. Our first question for the evening is really trying to understand how we got to where we are today. And so really, we want to know, how did we get to this point where we're seeing college athletics, despite there being a pandemic happening, it's still college athletics are still being played. We've seen the postponement of different games every single week. We're seeing outbreaks amongst college athletic teams constantly. It seems like every other day there's a report. So Dr. Jackson, we'll start with you actually about how did we get here today?
Sure. Well, I think there were some conferences, and my work focuses on predominantly white institutions in the Power Five in particular. So I think it'll help to put that out there before I dive into this. But, college sports, intercollegiate athletics, they're in the business of excellence, and that's winning. And if there was going to be a conference that was going to play in the fall, it actually, kind of reflecting back on it now, although we saw these statements like, we are not playing until at least January 1st, full stop. We are not reconsidering this. And then, like the Big Ten conference and the Pac-12 conference walking that back. I do think it's because we've seen other Power Five conferences going forward with it. And it's because like these programs, you know, I think they get a lot of heat from critics when they say we're not in the business of making money. And that's actually true. They're not in the business of making money. They're in the business of spending money, because you have to spend money to be excellent and win. And so I think, you know, the president can claim that he brought back Big Ten football, but I really think it was this anxiety that people in intercollegiate athletics feel that they're gonna be behind in the recruiting game, because that's what matters. It's not the current athletes, it's the future athletes. It's this recruiting arms race. And that's why we see the exorbitant spending that's accelerated in the last 15 years from $4 billion a year to $14 billion a year. We can't get out of this bad habit of spending. And that's all kind of predicated on this idea that we're in the business of excellence and winning. So I think that's why we've seen schools move from saying, if there's no students on campus, there will be no athletes on campus playing sports, walking that back almost instantly to football players are like all other athletes. And therefore, if there's going to be a football season, there have to be other fall sports, to the Big Ten not playing other fall sports and only playing football. So I think what the pandemic has made clear is that football is categorically different from other sports on university campuses. Football players give much more than they get in return, and they deserve more. And that's what I've seen, at least in the last few months.
Thank you for that. Dr. White and Dr. Silva, do you all have anything you'd like to add?
I'll go. Sure. Yeah, no, I think Victoria's outlined, I think the parameters of which drive college athletics at this current moment. I think I'd like to add is that they are, she says they're in the business of spending money, but you have to make money to spend money, right? And I think part of what's driving this football, in particular football, but also the subsequent sports that have been able here at the University of Kentucky and the SEC, we've seen a full slate of fall sports begin this semester, is that, you know, really what we're talking about is this unbelievable desire to maintain this kind of athletic budget. And so it's in the name of winning, absolutely. But at the same time, it is very much tied to these television deals that have been, that drive a tremendous amount of the dollars, right? Like, and I think that the entire athletic infrastructure, I think Victoria speaks, her work talks about this quite regularly. The entire infrastructure from football all the way down to sailing at some institutions is driven by these dollars that are brought in the revenue generating sports led by football. And so I think when I think there's a principal in the spring that was like, we can't do this because this seems dangerous to, and then an accountant came in and was like, let me tell you what it's going to cost you to not play. And from that point on, you've seen programs come hell or high water continue to move forward. I'll add that the Big Ten is an interesting case study. And I think when we get a little bit of space and time and some documents, we'll be able to tell a really interesting story. The Big Ten is probably the most interesting conference in the Power Five in the sense that it imagines itself, its leaders imagine itself aligned and closely aligned to the Ivy League academically. At the same time, athletically, it is in a competition with the SEC. And I think that this is really a kind of interesting kind of dynamic. And this is why I think we speak to this initial, like, we're not playing to January, in part because they thought other schools would follow them, and the other conferences would follow them. I'll end with having worked in the Ivy League before moving to the University of Kentucky. It is an interesting, to me, a phenomenally different kind of space where we use this rhetoric of the student athlete. And they too are very uncomfortable with this idea of athletics at the collegiate level, but they have no qualms whatsoever about canceling athletics in a heartbeat and not worrying about even trying to come back even in the spring, right? And so I think that there's a sense that for them, it's really one of a handful of high achieving athletics that really does value the academic side of the ledger in such a way that it is willing to sacrifice the entire athletic structure in the name of health and safety. But that said, they also don't have a $50 billion, $10 billion TV deal as well. So
appreciate that. Dr. Silva?
Yeah, I would add both Victoria and Derek mentioned the revenue and the reliance or the necessity for these programs to get this revenue. And I think we have to ask ourselves, why are our universities so heavily reliant on revenue generated from college athletics? And I think it's a broader question, and it's a historical question about the massive systemic underfunding and cutting of funding of higher education over the past 5 decades in North America. And with that, we also saw the rise of reliance on revenue to replace our revenue from college athletics to replace that funding. So I think, like, in historical context, we have to ask ourselves, is this okay? And how do we kind of envision the future of both collegiate athletics, but also the future of higher education more broadly?
Thank you for that. Nia, I'd like to swing it to you now, given the fact that you are a current athlete and you've experienced firsthand what's going on, especially given the fact that as a basketball player, your season was cut short. There was a lot of uncertainty over the summer. And now, as far as I'm aware, you are currently practicing or engaging practices for the season.
Yeah, it's been very challenging. It's very demanding. At my school, basketball for us is, our demanding sport. It's the most popular sport. So it was a very big push for us to play. It just was, a lot of rules, a lot of things that, typical college athletes don't have to go through. Granted, we are in a pandemic, but, it has been challenging, in practices wearing a mask. A lot of people don't hear, but it's very difficult to run, sprints with a mask on your face. And it's hard to get to really know your teammates because we haven't engaged in contact practice yet. We plan to do that soon. But prior to that, we've just been doing kind of like isolation workouts, I guess you could say. So it was kind of hard to get a feel for the team. I feel like we're not we're behind the mark in regards into our season coming up. It sucks that it gets cut short. But yeah, it's just been a challenge and we're just trying to get through it and do the best that we can do in our situation.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you for that, Nia. I guess, as an athlete, are you concerned at all, given the fact that you consider yourself behind, or you're concerned at all that your team's behind heading into the season?
Yeah, because I'm a very competitive person. I don't like to lose, I mean, who does like to lose? Everyone wants to win. So I guess you can say it's kind of frustrating that we're not able to get to that point of, where we normally would be in season. Normally it would be preseason right now. We would be doing this, X, Y, and Z. But due to the pandemic, we're not. So I guess you can say it's just been a little frustrating, not what I hoped for, but, I can't get everything that I want. But I guess you can say that we're making do with what we can do in terms of our situation. But yeah, it's been a challenge doing that. But in regards to playing in the fall and being behind, we just got to do the best that we can do because it's out of our hands at this point. We just got to show up and play.
Thank you for that, Nia. For those of you that don't know, Nia is my sister. So watching your little sister play basketball and attend university in person is interesting as someone that studies sport. And like those on the panel, I also have a critical perspective that I bring to sport. And so this question is for Dr. Jackson, and then I'm going to pivot to Dr. White. Lots of advocates of playing during this time have made remarks saying, well, what about the mental health of these athletes? If they don't play, what do they have? And so we've seen conversations about student athlete identity development and athletes needing to play for the sake of their mental health status. So can you talk to that a little bit? And why do you think individuals are bringing up this perspective given the circumstances that we're in?
Well, I like to take the question as an honest question and not a but what about, or like, come on. And it's true. athletes, all the messaging you receive if you're an elite college athlete from a very young age is that this is what you're good at. And often when you hear that messaging all of the time and you're kind of getting all of this reinforcement that your identity becomes conflated with what you do, that when what you do is ripped away, you have a complete identity crisis. And I do a lot of speaking with current college athletes, both at my institution, ASU, with Sun Devil Athletics, and also on other campuses. And oftentimes when I'm with athletes, I want to get them thinking about like how, like, part of the deal is that you get injured and that you don't feel like yourself when you're not playing your sport, that you're more sad than you are usually. And so I became really concerned in March when sports were stopped about the mental health and well-being of our students who play sports, because it's like an injury when you have it ripped away and you don't get that regular dopamine, and you're so used to getting that exciting feedback of working really hard, putting yourself on the line, that vulnerability when we play or race or compete. And that's completely gone. You know, the camaraderie that you get hanging out with your teammates and working with them toward a goal. So yeah, I get it. And I also understand that players want to play, athletes want to play. And that like most athletes I've spoken with who are current athletes wanted to go back to campus and were destroyed when their seasons were postponed, because if you're an athlete who's just at the brink of making it to that next level and now that's gone, like, all this work you've put in for all these years is suddenly a big question mark. So I absolutely get that worry and concern about our athletes and their mental health. That said, this has been an issue among college athletes. Mental health has been an issue among college athletes for a long time before the pandemic. And we've had increasing rates of depression and anxiety among college students, but college athletes especially in recent years. And that has to do with this incredible pressure they feel to balance academic and athletic roles and responsibilities. But that's not to say that the pandemic has introduced something new. It's something that we all of us who care about students who play sports, need to spend more time thinking about and reaching out to athletes to make sure, do those check-ins and make them feel good about, knowing that this is common, that they're not different in some way for not feeling so great right now.
Thank you for that. Now, Dr. White, on the flip side, we've seen advocates of continuing with sport during this time say, well, our athletes are in the best shape. They are our most, they have the best physical prowess right now. If anyone was to bounce back from this virus, it's them. One, can you speak to that conundrum? And two, what underlying issues do you see with that perspective when we're applying to the population of athletes that are playing right now, and really where that push for that population is coming from?
Well, I think it's twofold, right? I think it's we in the United States, but I imagine this may be a global problem, we lack a lot of number sense. So when someone says that 99.9 or 7% of the people recover, when you multiply that by a large data set, like a large number, that's a lot of people in that 0.3%, right? And I think that's the question you have to ask, right? So that's one. And so some of it's just that, like, we always imagine that that's literally nobody, but it really could turn out to be, hundreds of thousands of people. And I think that's a question that, do we want to live with those kinds of results, especially that they're unknown? Two, I also think that there's this situation in which we just don't know. And I think the part that I have that is the most troubling for me is that we just don't know what the long-term implications are. And I think that when you combine the unknown of this virus, plus the fact that the kind of exploitation that is built into the collegiate system, it makes for, to me, a terrible set of messaging. And I think it is a different set of stances from professional sports, where the players have a labor union and they can make the decision to do so, and they can do a kind of cost benefit analysis of whether or not they should play. Like, Is this financially, in my career, worthwhile? The thing that we treat is that the contradiction that is embedded in college athletics is that these students, everyone's like, they get a scholarship. Well, that's what their scholarships for. The university gives a ton of scholarships for a lot of different kinds of things, right? Like people in band get a scholarship, people in orchestra get scholarship. We have merit scholarship. And so those students are not asked to put themselves at risk, especially as colleges have gone online. I've made these kinds of adjustments to protect the safety and wellness of their student population. No one's ever clamoring for the orchestra to get back into the concert hall, right? Like there's not any of that, right? Like, and this is not to shame them, but this is a disingenuous argument. And so I think Victoria's point about really being concerned about the mental health and the identity is a very important decision, because these young people have basically built their entire lives around playing sports, and it becomes very difficult to make that adjustment. But that's also an intense criticism of the American sports industry as well, right? Where we are watching parents and communities of all classes and races pour all this kind of money and energy into an quote unquote amateur sports system that really benefits a segment of the collegiate population, right? It, as I say all the time, that these sports are still extracurricular, right? They're not the curriculum. And so I think that those two things have to be considered. And so I'm just worried that there are so many unknowns. There are, the question that you have to ask when someone says, what about these young, healthy people and their percentages? How many people are you willing to live to be permanently injured or possibly die? How many of that's okay in the name of some college sport? And when we ask that question and you're okay with that, that's the calculus that we're asking administrators and universities to do in the name of television contracts, which student athletes don't necessarily see.
Thank you for that. I'm going to now pivot to Dr. Silva. How are you making sense of these dominant ideologies right now?
Yeah. Just to kind of build on both Victoria and Derek, the idea that we have, we have to obviously support the mental and physical health of athletes. That onus is on universities, university administrators, to provide, sort of put your money where your mouth is and provide athletes with supports, both to support mental health and to support physical health in the absence of something like collegiate athletics. But I really want to drive home this the unknown characteristic that Dr. White was speaking to. And there's a recent study that just came out in JAMA Cardiology that suggests upwards of 15% of collegiate athletes showed signs of myocarditis. Gavin Yamey of Duke Public Health recently came on the End of Sport and told us that studies suggest that up to 10% of people will face long-term disabling symptoms from COVID. This is what's often called the long haulers in sort of public rhetoric, but we don't know any of that. And so because we don't know that, throwing the sort of herd immunity out there for this segment of the population, which is basically what's happening in collegiate athletics, where we're suggesting that, and Coach O of LSU actually did suggest this, that, we just have to kind of throw it out there and most of our players will catch this virus. That doesn't really make any sense, because we don't know whether or not you will hold immunity, for instance. We don't know whether or not you can catch it for a second time. We don't know the long-term effects. And I want to speak or speaking to college football players that we do on the End of Sport. I always think of if a college athlete plays and gets this virus, and then in 5 years, they go for a medical to sign a contract, a professional contract, and something comes up like an enlarged heart or myocarditis, how will they be negatively impacted? And these discussions are not happening in collegiate athletics, and they're not happening when we've kind of thrown all football basically in the Power Five. We've kind of just thrown it out there so that we can all be entertained.
Thank you so much. And lastly, Nia, just want to get an athlete's perspective. One, how are you making sense of just, being the topic of discussion as it relates to, people having these different opinions and different perspectives when you really became a collegiate athlete to play? So how are you making sense of this political dynamic and also understanding the virus, being in contact with others? Just speak to that a little bit.
It's been challenging. I feel like it's been hard to get, I don't attend a predominantly, Power Five school. So getting an athlete's voice heard, you think has the, athletics, have they stopped and asked us, hey, what do you guys want to do? How do you feel? Does this make you okay? And so the sense of, traveling and playing other schools, for me, honestly, it's a little scary. And it's not like, we're not the NBA. We don't get our own personalized bubble, our own room. And it's really a scary thing. I don't want to go into a game, with the mindset of thinking, oh, I don't know where she's been. I don't want to touch her. And, basketball is a contact sport, and there's no way to go around that. We have to touch people. We have to be, 6 feet, closer than 6 feet to play the game that we love. But at the end of the day, I value my health more, and I'd rather be safe at the end of the day than, risk myself to go play a couple basketball games. Sad to say, I might, miss out a year, but, basketball is my passion. But if I'm not alive, to play or watch my passion, then what's the point? So I guess you can just say it's been challenging. It's been scary. I know every athlete has a different perspective, but for me personally, it's just a little nerve-wracking because I care about my health. I don't want to infect my family. You think about the future. So, yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, Nia. And I think you, as well as the other panelists, have touched on a really important distinction between the college and the professionals. And so Dr. Derek White, you discussed sort of the players associations, and then they have a particular power in developing kind of what happens and how players interact. And then you also mentioned the right to choose, whether these individuals have the right to choose to participate in there. So I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on that, because as far as I'm aware, the NCAA has provided college athletes the ability to opt out and still, maintain their eligibility.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a labor question, right? Like, I think at the end of the day, the ability to play sports is a labor during a pandemic is a labor question, right? And it's an acute labor question that has, as we discussed, as my colleague Derek Silva just mentioned, like, we have so many unknowns. And I think that what the labor union has done for the professional ranks is set the boundaries and terms upon which their participation will happen. Not only do they have a seat at the table, they have the ability to withdraw their labor from the kind of circumstance. I think what makes college sports very challenging is, instead of making this a collective decision as a labor union, this is an individual decision. And what this does for an individual athlete at a college who decides to opt out is it puts them under intense pressure from their teammates, from the coaches, from the fans, from their classmates about why they are choosing to not play during a pandemic. And we can underestimate this, and we say that these are big, strong athletes, male and female athletes. But at the end of the day, they are still college age students who are feel the pressure of peer pressure. And they are aiming to please their coaches, their teammates, their families in some cases, right? And I think that is part of, for me, that's often a huge part of my biggest concern, right? And so they have to trust. The other part is it requires a level of trust. you have to trust that your program or trust that your institution is going to do the right thing, is going to do, select of the number. There are multiple ways that you can test student athletes. Which one of these tests has the lowest false positives? Like, we don't, like, student athletes have, that's what your labor union rep is supposed to do, is to figure out which one of these is the best circumstance for you as a unit. And what we've come to find out over the summer is that each school, because this is the way college sports works, is that each school is coming up with their own set of protocols. So some schools were testing twice a week. Some schools were testing once a week. Some schools were testing once you only had symptoms, until we figured out that asymptomatic spreading is the primarily mechanism that we've seen through the testing. And so there's no really set guidelines. And then it's up to the conferences to try to create guidelines. And some conferences are far more stringent. The Big Ten has come in and said, look, if you test positive, you have to sit out 21 days of quarantine. That's going to, that's unprecedented, right? We are watching young student athletes come back and talking about coming back in 10 days at other institutions, right? And so but that means that, if you're playing someone from a different conference, you don't know what those testing protocols are. And I think that this is the thing that student athletes were really starting to figure out this summer, when we saw the Pac-12 students come together, when we saw the Big Ten students come together and make kind of, certain kinds of demands. They were making that as a labor organization. They didn't describe themselves as a labor union, but that was really the function that they were operating under.
That's perfect setup. Thank you, Dr. White. For our next question, which is, while we have the professional organizations, unions and the players associations, we have seen a very unprecedented labor action or labor movement amongst college athletes. So Dr. Silva and Dr. Jackson, if you could speak to what we have seen and kind of place it within that historical context.
Yeah, I think what we saw through the summer was exactly as you put it, an unprecedented labor mobilization. But in the initial stages of the Big Ten and the Pac-12 movement, we saw a lot of solidarity. We saw things like hashtag We Are United, hashtag We Want to Play. We saw these groups organizing to create or to have a say in their labor conditions and in their working conditions as they returned to play. We saw this happen, and I think I would argue, and I did myself and colleagues Nathan Coleman Lamb and Johanna Mellis argued that they were really successful in pushing the Big Ten and the Pac-12 to originally cancel the season. But it was, I hypothesize, and we've argued this as well, it had more to do with the labor mobilization than the health than any health risk at all. And we've seen a variety of companies try this same thing. When employees start organizing and start mobilizing together, places like Walmart have threatened closure, or they've actually closed to stop that labor mobilization. And one of the things that I think is under discussed, and we haven't really talked about a lot, is how the Pac-12 and the Big Ten kind of did this. They stopped, or they canceled the season right after, the day after the Big Ten came out with their demands. So the whole labor mobilization thing was powerful and brilliant, and we should all be supporting athletic laborers as they fight for some of these for say in their working conditions. But we can't just ignore the fact that the Big Ten and the Pac-12 went to cancel class to kind of bulldoze the athletic labor movement. And then as soon as the sort of movement kind of pittered out a little bit, at least vocally, there was no hashtag going on. There was no calls for say in your working condition. As soon as that kind of went, we saw the Big Ten and the Pac-12 return, and they're returning this week. So I think we have to pay attention to the history of this as a labor movement, but also the response the contemporary response of institutions within the Big Ten and the Pac-12, because they were pretty successful in hushing or silencing this brilliant, powerful, and amazing labor movement that we saw throughout the summer.
Dr. Jackson, I want to swing it over to you now. We did say this is unprecedented, but there is a history of student athlete or college athlete activism trying to build and gain labor rights. So if you could just provide some of that historical context, as well as kind of what they're asking for, what they're demanding, what has that looked like in the past, and how has it shifted given the pandemic?
Sure. This is where we see the intersection of the pandemic and concerns about health and well-being with racial justice and economic justice. And there's a long history here. There is change over time. So athletes in 2020 calling out college sports for being systemically racist would have been kicked off their teams with their scholarships revoked. And that's what happened in the late 60s. So 50 years later, there is change in that athletes can express themselves in this way and not be kicked out of school for it. So I do want to acknowledge that. What frustrates me as a beneficiary of collegiate amateurism, and I think it's important to say that I benefited from the system of college sports, which is a bifurcated system. Now I'm an educator. I teach the history of college sports. I take this seriously, and I feel a responsibility to take on this action so that the athletes don't have to. And that burden has always been carried by Black athletes and Black women athletes. And so if we look at this historical through line and all of the reform actions that have taken place within big time college sports, the schools aren't doing that on their own goodwill. It's in reaction to Black athlete activism. It's in reaction to cane culture trying to unionize Northwestern football players and having a platform, and then the schools virtually adopting every plank on cane culture's platform and claiming it as if they did it on their own, by their own goodwill. And so I wrote a piece in June feeling this responsibility, calling on universities to take a year off from college sports, to use this moment instead of trying to play, and now we're seeing that in action, how hard this is to try to play with all these postponements, with so many athletes contracting COVID-19. We should have just taken this year off to reimagine college sports. And now instead we have, these incredibly strong athletes taking a big risk, putting themselves out there, because history also tells us what happens to these athletes who take a stand. And again, like, this isn't to say they shouldn't have. I'm so proud of them for doing so, but I feel like we've failed. Educators, those of us, there are so many people who work in academia who are former college athletes who should have taken this on, especially those of us who have benefited from it. The universities should have owned this, not the athletes. And I'm disappointed that, again, we keep repeating this history over and over.
Thank you for that, Dr. Jackson. Nia, you are a current athlete. You are obviously witnessing everything that is happening. How do you make sense of it? Where do you stand in terms of engaging in sort of taking a stance to standing up to what's going on with the pandemic?
Well, I love it. I love seeing athletes use our platform and get our voices heard. I would love to be able to, walk out with my Black Lives Matter t-shirt. Granted, if I was an athlete, years ago, but I'm not. But, that wouldn't be allowed. I would have been shamed for that. And so I love that athletes are using their voices and using their platform, because at the end of the day, it's our bodies being put through the workouts. It's our bodies that are playing. It's our health that's at risk. And, in such a crazy time in the world, we're in a pandemic. There's a lot of, racial issues that exist in the world, and they weren't getting talked about until, athletes decided to take a stand and demanded that we need to discuss this. And it was just a powerful thing to see. And I love that it's happening. Specifically at my school, we're doing a lot more. Me and my fellow teammates are trying to, get people talking. And a lot of people don't want to talk when it's, something that makes them uncomfortable. But I think as a nation, we need to be okay with being uncomfortable and discuss these things.
Thank you for that, Nia. Everyone has alluded to it in some way, so I want to build upon examining this intersection of all this is taking place on the backdrop of BLM. And so I first want to ask this question to Dr. White. As we know, COVID-19 is impacting Black and Brown communities disproportionately in comparison to white communities here in the US. And so when we're looking at who's playing right now, what connection is there at the intersection of race and gender and collegiate athlete labor union or unionizing or consider mobilizing and the pandemic? Is there any connection at all we can make given this is happening on BLM?
Yeah, I think Victoria's point about taking a hiatus for a year, it was a missed opportunity. I think part of it was the fear, and this goes back to, let me connect Derek's earlier point about that the Pac-12 and Big Ten student athletes, when they made their kind of united push, much of this was able to develop because they had time for the first time in their entire lives. One of the things, and Nia, I'm sure you know this, and Victoria knows this from her experience. I played soccer at Maryland. Like, the thing that you realize the most is that they control most of your time, right? Like, it is class, it is practice, it is study hall, it's sleep, it's eat, it's in that same kind of wheelhouse. And you try to carve out like an existence of a life as a student athlete. So you want to go to a party at some point just so you have an opportunity to do this. And what that does in many ways is that it limits your ability to kind of stop and slow down and think about what's happening and what this kind of treadmill is like. And so in some cases, this is what an injury does for a lot of student athletes, is for the first time they're able to like stop and think a little bit about like, okay, what happens when the ball stops for the first time. But I think that this stoppage in the stoppage in March, and then when we combined with the George Floyd protests this summer, allow for student athletes to connect the dots for the first time. And I think that that is an important piece. And one of the things that was lost is that much of the summer protests happened when students weren't in class. So we missed an opportunity for students to come back to campus, student athletes to come back to campus, to engage in the faculty members who are having these discussions in their classes on a regular basis. Because many of you know that depending on what sports you play, the entire academic curriculum is not available. Does it conflict with your practice time? Does that professor have a history of being a difficult grader when we're trying to keep you eligible? Like, these are all real live questions that happen for many student athletes. And if your job, if you're an administrator and your job is to make sure your student athletes stay eligible, you're not trying to take any chances and putting them in places that they don't, in classes that they may not, you don't want them to get development in terms of asking too many questions, or in classes that may detrimentally hurt their eligibility. And so this is we missed an opportunity this fall in particular to sit down and to have this discussion, for campuses to reach out to the experts on their campus. I mean, here at the University of Kentucky, our head football coach Mark Stoops and basketball coach Calipari both came out and talked about how they were wearing Black Lives Matter t-shirts, and this was, they were talking about how they're supportive of the movement. And one of the things that I've said in public and in private is that, if you want we need to figure out, these are hard questions that we have to do. And I'm like, yes, they are. And you know who can do it? Like, we have an entire program of African-American studies full of experts who've been studying this for decades. Lean on our expertise. We don't go to your job and be like, if we got on the radio and said, we should fire Coach Cal because he didn't run the right play, when we don't even know how to run the right play or what the right play should have been. People on the basketball side of the equation are laughing at us because they know we don't know what we're talking about. And I think that same kind of opportunity was missed. And I think that this rush to play now has got us back on this treadmill again. And the student athletes, in addition with, I think that Zoom classes are much more difficult on our entire student body in different kinds of ways, in part because you don't get that connection. I can't tell if my students are physically struggling with the material. I can't read their body language. I can't do the things that the cues, if you've been in the classroom for a number of years, you recognize and you say, hey, I need to go back over this material again, because everybody has a strange look on their face. In this platform, almost everybody has that strange look on their face all the time, right? And so I think that it creates a different kinds of challenges. And so we missed this opportunity to really hammer home the ways in which race and class and gender and labor are functioning in our student athletes' lives, but in our students' lives as well.
Thank you for that. Now, Dr. Silva, I pose the same question to you. How are you making sense of all these different things coming together in this moment?
Yeah, I think we shouldn't and can't look at what's happening today in college football in a vacuum. We can't look at just the rush to play. We can't look at labor mobilization as if they sort of all just happened and we all got sucked up and things are now the way they are. But they're actually a complex kind of constellation of all of these things. Like, we can't deny that the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, and ultimately the shooting of Jacob Blake, didn't have an effect on the WNBA, for instance, and didn't have an effect on the NBA. And then when they sort of mobilized in a variety of ways, we saw a sort of impetus given to or provided for collegiate athletes to also do the same. All of these things were happening with social rebellion, with Black Lives Matter, with these powerful protests that we're seeing take hold across the world. All of these things were happening over the summer in the midst of a raging pandemic. So all of these things, I think, are inherently connected and inherently have to do with, as Professor White said, with race, class, gender, and labor, and our history of exploitation of particular races, classes, and genders. And I think, just to add a little bit to both Professor Jackson and White in terms of our missed opportunity, I think that it was beyond a missed opportunity to reimagine collegiate athletics. I think we are, in an ongoing way, missing an opportunity to rethink higher education as an entire system and as an entire structure. And I think that if we put that first and rethink higher education and how we do it, how we fund it, how we admit students to our programs, how we grade students, how we accept or don't accept tuition, all of these, if we think about that first, then we can start dealing with some of the harms associated with college athlete exploitation, and in particular, an exploitation that is heavily along gendered and race lines.
Thank you, Dr. Silva. And so I want to build on this idea of reimagine, because ultimately this Beyond the Field series is housed in a sport management program. The individuals that we graduate go on to work in the sport industry, and there is definitely a flux happening, especially in college athletics, where we're seeing programs get cut, whole departments being closed down. So there's a real economic impact to college athletics that is happening because it's not happening, because college athletics are not being played. And Dr. Jackson, earlier you stated that it's really on the administrators and the educators to take that initiative, but don't they have a bit of like their hand in the pot, a little bit of like their own economic concerns that they have to worry about? And so I was just wondering if you could elaborate on that, Dr. Jackson.
I'm going to try to connect this to the conversation around Black Lives Matter and what's going on in this as an industry, and kind of take a big step back. So Ramogi Huma, who's executive director of the National College Players Association, likes to say that name, image, and likeness, restoring to students who play sports the economic rights of all students, is an economic justice issue and a racial justice issue. And what's fascinating to me is that we have this effort to deal with a pandemic and bring back football alongside athletic departments kind of grappling with how they're going to support their athletes in Black Lives Matter, alongside crazy movement in Washington, D.C. through both the courts and Congress. So in reaction to first California passing the Fair Pay to Play Act around name, image, and likeness, and many other states following California's lead, the NCAA and its lawyers and lobbyists have been working congressional halls to try to get Congress to step in, try to get an antitrust exemption, and come out with some sort of name, image, and likeness that's very watered down. I'm skeptical of this most recent NCAA proposal around name, image, and likeness. I think it's arrogant. I think it's we're going to pretend that we're going to do this awesome version of it, and then guess what? Congress has our backs. That's high stakes. That's crazy high risk game that's going on. But if we're thinking about name, image, and likeness, this is a racial justice issue. So there, whether or not colleges like it, change may be coming soon, because this is a broken model. It's a bad business model, and it's not an educational model of sport. And so you have heavy hitting senators, including, Cory Booker, who played football at Stanford, Richard Blumenthal, who was a swimmer at Harvard, Elizabeth Warren, Chris Murphy, who's been on this for a long time. And I encourage people to go and look at the reports on college sports that have been coming out of Chris Murphy's office. They want to do this reimagining. And then through the courts, we have the Alston decision, and whether or not the Supreme Court is going to take that up. And that it's right around this idea of grant and aid if it's an artificial restriction on the compensation going to athletes. So this, there was great anxiety in the 1970s among the NCAA around the Amateur Sports Act and what to do with the Olympic development and the Olympic movement in the United States. And the NCAA looked and saw the AAU get stripped of its power over the Olympic movement, and the NCAA got scared. And I think that plays into the story of why they fell in line with adopting women's championships, because they've been fighting Title IX. They've been trying to get an exemption from providing sporting opportunities for women. So when we take a big step back, there's a lot more going on right now in the college sports space when it comes to what this is going to look like in 5 years and 10 years. And absolutely, it's captured by the pandemic. If anything, the pandemic has made clear that football is categorically different from other sports, that this is a broken model, that this spending has gotten out of control, and absolutely, athletes deserve more. The first priority, if sports are going to be in schools, education and serving those students who play sports has to be the first priority.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. I'd like to hear Dr. Silva and Dr. White, your thoughts on this, and then also Nia, your thoughts as well. But prior to doing that, this will be the last question from us this evening, and then we're going to be taking questions from the audience. At the bottom of your screen, if you're on Zoom, there's a Q&A box where you can submit your questions. So please do so, and we'll do our best to answer them after these answers. So Dr. Silva, we'll hear your voice next.
Yeah, so one of the, I think, great travesties that we're seeing here is that, and I'm saying this again, but it's purposeful, that we have been kind of systematically underfunding public education for the past 50 years. And with that, we are over-relying on college athletic revenue and revenue generated from that sport, like football, and like Dr. Jackson mentioned. But with that, we're starting to see how that is a completely broken system when we think of, so we've been getting revenue from all these programs from college athletics for years and years and years. Where has that money been going? And why is it with 1 year of a lost season or lost revenue from college athletics, why is it now that we're suddenly in complete full neoliberal austerity mode, or completely cutting, furloughing not only faculty, but contingent faculty, staff members, resident staff, cleaners of a variety of kinds, service people in our universities. Why is it that that is the option? That has to be the option. I would argue that we should be looking in the mirror as universities in North America, particularly in Power 5 revenue generating programs, and think like, where did this money go? And why is LSU and Alabama have the biggest and most fancy dressing rooms? They have 80,000 person stadiums. They pay their coaches millions of dollars. Dan Mullen makes $6 million. Dabo Sweeney makes over $9 million. And yet we're in this sort of moment where we have to lay off our educational staff to continue this system. I think that that's a massive travesty. And something that is particularly problematic when you consider places like the University of Texas, which has a $30 billion endowment. Why is it that education has to be cut in order to provide for an already failing system? And I think it's on our leaders in Washington. It's on people who have systematically gutted our education system and made us rely on out-of-state tuition, international tuition, residence, the quote-unquote college life, and all of these things. We need to rethink higher education. We need to rethink what we're doing in our universities in order to make sense of a post-pandemic world, I think.
Let me, I think those are fantastic. I think they've laid out the stark terms upon which the challenges facing us in terms of reimagining college athletics. I will say that for me, I think the solution is, in one level, in taking consideration name, image, and likeness, as well as other things, is, professional basketball has a salary cap, right? LeBron James is the most dominating player in the world, and at whatever his salary is, like 27 or 30 million, is underpaid, right? In part because they have a salary cap that forces them to pay a roster fee. It seems like college sports, where we see coaches who will never win a national title, make more than professional coaches who win playoff games. And this system, just in terms of an athletic sense, right? Like, not even thinking about the academic side of the house, is that this issue is really, if we want to find the revenue that is equitable for the student athletes and find revenue that is equitable for the university at large, part of that revenue has to come in and say, look, we should not be paying college football coaches $9 million a year, right? At Michigan, you should not have 3 or 4 coaches on the football team making in excess of $1 million a year, no matter where that money comes from, right? No matter if it comes from television dollars or boosters or wherever. Like, at some point, we have to say that this is too much. And so to me, there's a sense that, like, look, the system is so out of whack that if the universities, the NCAA, someone has to say, look, you cannot make this more than this amount. This is the maximum amount of money you can make as a college football coach. That will still be 10 or 20 or 30 times more than the average faculty member will make. But if you say that the max you can make as a head football coach in Power 5 is $3 million, well, now we've got $6 million that we can redistribute to either student athletes or to the academic side of the ledger. It means we're not putting more money in facilities that are unnecessarily. You do not need the fanciest locker room with a slide like they have at Clemson. Some of this stuff is completely absurd. And that there should be this kind of thing, because if the NBA if LeBron James, who should be making $100 million a year, is not making $100 million a year, and Dan Mullen, who is making $5 or $6 million a year to finish in the middle of the pack every single year, the whole system is messed up. And so somebody, if as administrators, going back, Charles, to your question, like, what is it that you should be advocating? You should be advocating for reducing to limiting the kinds of expenses that we are paying on salaries. I think that is a huge part of this. And especially at the top end of the salaries. We're not talking about secretaries. We're not talking about the ticket takers and the people who work in the ticket office or student life or the tutors. We're talking about the fact that brand new college football coaches in Power 5 walk into a job where they make $2.5 million. And an average full professor at any one of these institutions at the high end probably makes 10 times less than that. And I think that that's something for us to acknowledge, that this again, if this is going to be extracurricular. Now, I think there's an option, right? Like, you can say to your coach, Dabo or Saban, that, look, if you want to make more money, there's a place where you could do that. It's called professional sports. Right. And I think that there's something to be said in this way. And if we don't have enough integrity to say that, and to say that, look, we should not be in the business of having a football budget that runs in the $40 million a year, this is a problem, right? And I think that that's really where we are at this situation. So this is how you get these locker rooms. This is, what are we doing with this? And so we come into this pandemic because we have to spend this money every year, and then all of a sudden everybody's broke. And I think this is a problematic. And now there are some schools that are really broke, but this is that some schools that are making money hand over fist are now saying, look, I don't know what we're going to do this year. You're paying your coach too much money. It's just, this is facts. And this is, we can fight about this every day. But as a professor, you're never going to tell me that you better win a title every single year for the next 20 years to get paid that much money in college sports. And no one's doing that. That's unrealistic. And so until we have that honest conversation about, like, no one wants to talk about how much other people make. But we should have that conversation when it comes to college athletics, especially when they can only make that amount of money because they don't pay players.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. White. I appreciate that. Nia, I'm going to give you the last word here. I have kind of a bit of a twofold question before we get into the audience Q&A. Is sort of, as a student athlete, you are the one that gets to reap these quote unquote benefits of the nice locker room, all of the extra Nike gear, all of those sorts of benefits that it supposedly receive. So how are you taking this idea around, well, we shouldn't be investing in those things, we should be investing in something else? But also then the other question I have for you to wrap up is just, what is it that you want to see from your coaches and from your administrators regarding what's happening with the pandemic, regarding what's happening with these inequities around the pay gaps and exorbitant expenses, and also what's happening with Black Lives Matter?
Well, to answer the first question, having a nice locker room is cool, getting gear, cool. But at the end of the day, for me personally, it still doesn't make up for how time consuming and how draining and tiring, like being a full, especially if you're an athlete, it's a full-time job. And, you try to find ways in where you are a regular student. And I feel oftentimes that the word student gets overlooked, quite a bit. And we just get seen as, oh, you're an athlete. You're supposed to do this. You're supposed to do that. But in reality, we're 18 to, 21, 22 years old, just trying to play sports and get our education. And so, yeah, it's really, gear's cool and all, but, it would be nice, to have coaches, administrators understand that, if it's not for us, they wouldn't be getting paid that amount of money. If we're not performing, you're not going to get paid as much as you do. And it's just, I wish people would realize that more, because without us, burning our bodies and, making sure we eat right, their check wouldn't be coming in. And I think that's why there's such a huge push and a demand, we have to be great. You have to do this. You have to do good in school. And, and I feel like that's because they want their check. They want to get paid, but we're the ones doing the work. It's our bodies, our time. To answer your second question, in the midst of all this, I would love to just see, there's a lot I would love to see. I would love to see a platform for student athletes to vocalize how they feel about this. I would love people to be understanding, because I know a few friends of mine did opt out to play the season due to the, COVID and stuff. and, you know, they get shamed for it or bashed on. And it's really, you know, sad to see. But you would ask someone, you know, imagine if you were in my shoes. Imagine if you were the athlete having to make this life decision. This isn't, you know, this isn't something small. Like, this is a global pandemic through a very crucial racial time, especially, you know, as a Black athlete at that. So I would love to see people be more understanding and respectful of these athletes' decisions and understand that, yes, athletics is very important, but there's so much more to that. You know, our lives are important, our education is important, but most especially our health.
Thank you for that, Nia, and thank you to our panelists for answering the questions and putting up with Charles and I for the last hour. I am now going to pivot to our attendees' questions. If possible, I would just like one panelist to answer the question. And I know this will be difficult. If possible, try to keep it between 45 seconds to a minute, because there's some really awesome questions that I want to get through. I know that's hard, but the first question I have for anyone on the panel is, to what extent can we trust universities and coaches' Black Lives Matter statements that occurred over the summer when we now see them putting their athlete lives in danger for entertainment and revenue? It's a good question, I know.
I'll do it. I'll do it quickly. To what extent can we trust it? I mean, I think Nia's point at the end means that there should be considerable suspicion, meaning that these coaches, their paycheck, their success, their ability to earn a living is very much directly tied to players. This goes back to Victoria's point that she made at the very beginning of this broadcast about recruiting, that it is in their best interest to say the right things in order for future recruits to come in, and always in this next group. And so I think that we should believe their sincerity until there's not, but to also recognize that they are that their positionality is very much directly related on athletic success on the field, and thus they would say the right thing in order to get the best players on the field and get future players into their program.
Thank you for that. Our next question is a sport law question, I'm assuming. This question states, what are, if any, potential legal implications for the NCAA and institutions with deciding to move forward with sports? So I think the student is interested in issues of negligence and liability. Does anyone want to speak to that?
Well, none of us are lawyers or law experts, but what was interesting is that during, I think it was the Judiciary Committee Senate hearing, and Mark Emmert was there at that one. I think there were 3, so I might be confusing some of them. It was made clear from the Senate to the NCAA that they needed to have standardized policies and procedures, that this was not a home rule situation, home rule being that these are institutions of higher education that make their own policies. I get that when it comes to curriculum, that schools should own academics, absolutely. But when it comes to the health and safety of athletes, this is where it is a decision to not have uniform policy, whether it's CTE and concussions, whether it's summer practices and heat stroke, and now the pandemic. And I want to say it was Richard Blumenthal who was like, Mark Emmert, you will be doing this, and the NCAA will be coming up with these standardized policies and procedures. Now, as far as like the legalities and the legal responsibility that these universities might hold and lawsuits and all of that, I am 100% sure university legal teams have been all over this since day one, and not just athletics, but bringing students back to campus. So if there are lawsuits, the schools have thought long and hard about how to protect themselves. And part of it is, I am empathetic actually to what schools are trying to navigate. Like, I still have a job, like I am also part of this industry, right? And so it is a very tricky balancing act that administrators and university legal teams have to play to be very careful and place the well-being of their students and athletes first, while also operating, a business in higher education and in college sports.
Thank you. And we have time for one more question. I'm sorry to our attendees. These are some really great questions. The last question is, as we all know, Title IX was implemented not to advance women's athletic participation, but it happened to occur. That was a ramification of Title IX in terms of policy implementation. So this question is curious, how do we make sense of collegiate athletic departments cutting sports, and particularly less popular men's sports during this time, and some women's sports, and how do we make sense of this with Title IX legislation?
I can take this. Sorry, Derek and Derek. Yeah, so I see Title IX. First of all, I'm never blaming women when I talk critically about Title IX. I'm not blaming women athletes, but I see Title IX as a gender justice shield that this is really dumbing it down and not explaining all of these historical forces in the 70s and 80s. But what happens is this idea of the broad and expansive athletic department, thanks to Title IX, with lots of Olympic teams. And look, we can point to the Olympic sport athletes and say, see, this is what the idyllic student athlete experience is. And oh, it's the football players' own fault that they can't graduate at the rate that the Olympic sport athletes do. That what happens is, when things are good, when all of this money is throwing through the industry, when things are good, that gender justice shield of Title IX actually protects both men and women's Olympic sports. That this continues to grow. It puts pressure on revenue generating sports to make more money so that everyone else can thrive, right? And then they're blamed when they don't perform as well in the classroom, and there's racial dynamics to all of this too, of course. But what happens is, when there isn't all this money flowing through the system, that gender justice shield gets flipped, because now it's protecting what matters most, which is football. So Title IX becomes a scapegoat. It's throwing the women under the bus. It's first, and then Title IX is what you say. We're not cutting sports because of football money. We're cutting sports because we are out of compliance with Title IX, and this is a Title IX issue. Well, it's football money, right? It's that they're protecting what matters so that all of this can thrive. And so it's not to say that I'm unsympathetic to Olympic sport athletes, men's Olympic sport athletes whose teams have been cut. That's tragic, that's horrible. But it also underscores that this is a broken model. It's not an educational model of sport. What Title IX reminds us is that playing sports in schools is educational. That's why Title IX applies in sports. And so it's underscoring that the true mission of all of this is college, intercollegiate athletics operating professional football teams, and then using that money for all sorts of industries, the entertainment and marketing functions of universities, the Olympic sports, and then it's convenient that those Olympic sport athletes that are propped up as, see, this is a world-class trade-off. This is what works. It's good and it works. And look, it's gender justice excusing racial injustice when we're looking at the racial dynamics as well.
Thank you,
Can I
Dr.
add
Jackson.
can I add just one thing really quickly? Because I think she did an important thing. Because now that I've moved back to the South, one of the things that's most striking, University of Kentucky notwithstanding, is that a number of the schools here in the Deep South and the SEC, we don't have this robust Olympic sport programs. The thing that struck me when I worked at Dartmouth was like they have like 37 sports, right? Like most of the schools are like, whatever the minimum we can have, we'll have the minimum. And part of it is this logic. And so I think there's a relationship between the kind of academic prestige a place will try to attain to and the kind of ways that we're willing to support Olympic sports, both men's and women's Olympic sports. And I think this is an interesting thing. And I think this is what was so shocking about Stanford's decision to cut several programs this summer, is that this is a school with this tremendous academic prestige, but also like 40 sports that they're sponsoring. And that like as Victoria, as I think so adequately explained, that when everything is going good, we can sponsor all these different things. But when it's not, now we have to shield the institution that is at play. And I think that we should also look at the institutions that do not even attempt to play those games and are basically keeping the fewest kind of programs to be Title IX compliant, but not expanding this robust. We don't have it, schools don't have equestrian and sailing and these other kinds of the title of Olympic sports that we often forget until the Olympics show up on our screens in the summer every 4 years. And I think that's an important kind of dynamic in the ways that race and class and prestige function even in the athletic world in the name of Title IX.
Thank you. And I hate to have to cut this conversation short, but we are beyond time now. And so I know that we could talk for hours and hours, and there's so many important intersecting issues that have come even more salient given the pandemic. If anything, what I've taken away from tonight is that the pandemic has really been the straw that has potentially broken the back of college athletics. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens as we move forward, as this continues on, as it's most likely going to continue on for at least a little bit longer. But thank you to each of our panelists, Dr. Silva, Dr. White, Dr. Jackson, Nia. Thank you for being here and spending this time with us. There's so much going on. You didn't have to be here, so we're very appreciative of that. Thank you again to the Dodd Human Rights Impact Center for being a sponsor. They've been a sponsor with us now for a number of years. Their support has gone a really long way to making this possible. And of course, thank you to Nia School of Education, where the sport management program is housed. They are also sponsored us and have continued to support us. So we're thankful for them as well. And thank you all for being here tonight. We really appreciate it. And we will post the the recorded version of this for you all, hopefully in the next day or two. Otherwise, have a wonderful evening, and thank you for spending the tonight with us.